Ladies and gentlemen, good evening everyone. It's a pleasure, buonasera, it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this new series of conversations with our good friend, Dr. Giovanni Aloi, whom I warmly welcome. Benvenuto, buonasera Giovanni. This year conversations will focus on the representation of nature, ecology, and climate crisis within the frame of Italian contemporary visual arts, and the series of lectures that will accompany us until mid-May are set in a frame, in a wider frame, as this year we will try as Italian Cultural Institute to focus on the same topic seen from different fields of artistic expression. I would also like to welcome and very warmly welcome and introduce Fabiola Tosi, who has recently joined the team of the Italian Cultural Institute as Assistant Director of Programs. Fabiola is a Chicago-based curator and arts administrator. Her curatorial work aims at unveiling cross-cultural practices as a platform for discussion around politically and socially engaged issues. She's a former exhibit project manager at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum in Chicago and assistant director of exhibition and programs for the US Pavilion at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. She also worked as program assistant for the 2017 Architecture Biennale and curatorial assistant for the Roger Brown Study Collection. She was a 2019-2020 Hatch curatorial resident at the Chicago Artists Coalition. In 2017, she received her MA in Arts Administration and Policy from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And after all of this, she decided to join the Italian Cultural Institute. So thank you, Fabiola. We're happy to have you with us. And tonight, Fabiola will introduce Giovanni's lecture, and she will later then moderate the Q&A. And regarding the Q&A, as usual, I encourage you to interact with us by using the Q&A tab that you find at the bottom of the screen. And I'd just also like to remind you that tonight's conversation is being recorded and will be available on the Italian Cultural Institute YouTube channel in a couple of days. So again, thank you, Giovanni. Thank you, Fabiola. I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Luca, and welcome everyone. So tonight, as Luca was saying, we introduced the first of a series of 5 lectures by Dr. Giovanni Aloi that will accompany us in the next couple of months. These lectures, again, are part of this year's program, Le Voci della Natura, Ecologies and Nature in Italian Arts, which is the leading theme for our programs in 2022. Our goal is to reflect on how nature has been represented in the arts and how artists and intellectuals have gained awareness on nature preservation and climate change. For this first lecture, Giovanni will discuss the work of Antonio Ligabue with a focus on his empathic relationship with the natural world. Many of you already know him, but nevertheless, Dr. Giovanni Aloi is an author, educator, and curator specializing in the representation of nature in art. He has published with Columbia University Press, Phaidon, MIT, Laurence King, and Prestel. He has contributed to BBC radio programs, worked at Whitechapel Art Gallery and Tate Galleries in London. He's a USA correspondent for Esse Magazine and a regular public speaker at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Italian Cultural Institute. Aloi has curated exhibitions in the US and Europe. He currently teaches modern and contemporary art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby Institute of Art in New York and London. So I'll leave the mic to Giovanni and we'll be back for the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. Thank you, Luca, for the invitation. And thank you all for showing up on Zoom, which is always a pleasure. that we might leave behind very soon, or hybridize very soon, whichever comes our way first. But I am very pleased to be able to talk to you tonight about Antonio Ligabue as part of a cycle of lectures that will allow us to explore the roots of ecology in Italian art, as well as contemporary developments too. And I remember when I pitched the idea of Antonio Ligabue to Luca in a kind of trepidatious way. I was a little concerned because Antonio Ligabue is a wild card in a number of ways. And he was excited about the thought that Ligabue would be the opener of our journey through art and ecology. And I couldn't agree more, because there are certain themes I'm going to address tonight, and I hope not to make things too heavy and complicated, but there are interesting notions that we need to explore and unpack before we can actually think more carefully about the environment, art, what art can do for the environment, and our shared ecological systems with the rest of the natural world. So I will give you a few coordinates. Of course, you need to know when Antonio Ligabue lived, which is useful as a starting point, but also wanted to map quickly some of the topics that we're going to cover tonight. We're going to talk about madness. We're going to talk about anthropocentrism. We're going to talk about nature, of course, outsider art, empathy, and we're moving on one of the important aspects that might link these all. In the context of this talk, I wanted to use the word madness because it lends itself to a long-standing tradition, philosophical tradition. And of course, it identifies Ligabue as a very different artist and a very different individual. And I will talk to you throughout the night about what that label entails in the context of the myth of the artist, and also in the context of Ligabue's life, how we can or we cannot understand his art, and how it boxes his art sometimes into a limiting contextual framework that at the end detracts from the work, but also from our understanding of nature as Ligabue allows us to see it. That's why I wanted to title the talk Seeing Nature, which is a very simple title, because we have become in a number of ways blind to nature. What has led us to climate change, what is leading us to the sixth extinction, is a relentless impoverishment of the world that we have actuated in a number of ways. And certainly in the 1 hour we have tonight, I won't be able to do justice to much of this argument. But I wanted to start from this article I wrote earlier on. Well, it was actually in 2021, towards the end of 2021, soon after COP26, where I felt particularly uneasy with some cliches that were being rehashed and that I didn't expect from researchers of the caliber of David Attenborough, who I absolutely adore. But my discontent was grounded in some of his conceptions that I found outdated. So for instance, the idea that humans are the greatest problem solvers to have ever existed on Earth. And then again, when he said, is this how our story is due to end? A tale of the smartest species doomed by that all too human characteristic of failing to see the bigger picture in pursuit of short-term goals. This is a specific brand of anthropocentrism. We're going to explore anthropocentrism today together and what it does to us. And it's difficult, right? Darwin told us we're animals a long time ago, back to the 19th century. The idea since the second half of the 19th century, the idea that we're animals has been sedimenting in our minds. We've mulled it over. We've come to accepting it as far as possible. And yet, if we are animals, then we must be the best, right? We're the most intelligent, the best problem solvers. We know that this train of thought has led us where we are today, because it has impoverished the natural world. And how can you possibly care for a natural world that always looks dumb and inferior to you, not worthy of our attention? So there is a question that I find that runs through our thinking about the natural world today and what Ligabue did, how he was misunderstood and how he found life challenging among others, that brings back a question of quality and diversity. The difference between us as animals and other animals is not a matter of quantity. We need to snap out of that cliche and think about diversity. If we think about diversity, we can appreciate how a butterfly might not have our skills in problem solving what humans need to problem solve, but it will have a different kind of diverse intelligence that's suited to the challenges that insect will face throughout its life. Challenges that we can't even imagine at times, some of which we can observe and some of which we can partly share, but others that will remain completely alien to us. So snapping out of this idea of we are more always, we are better, helps us to see the natural world not as inferior, not as a resource to exploit, and animals as these machines that are non-sentient and rudimentary, and to explore each animal as well as biosystems in terms of diversity. What does that do? It has a series of important ramifications that we're going to explore tonight. So anthropocentric miseducation, what is it? It's what I call our state of mind, our centrality, the idea that we still believe today that we're the best thing on earth and that we are essential to it, while science has told us over and over and over again that if we disappear tomorrow, the planet will get on pretty well without us, and animals will take over again, plants will take over again, will be reabsorbed, human culture will disappear very quickly without the planet even like noticing. And this idea that we're central, that we're essential, and that we are even stewards of the planet, we have responsibilities, that we have self-appointed ourselves, comes from different places. Again, in an hour, I run courses of 16 weeks at SAIC about these ideas. In an hour, it's going to be very difficult to pinpoint how these ideas are important to us tonight, but you will see that they are. One of the sources of anthropocentric miseducation can be found in different religions, not just Christianity, but to simplify, many religions place the human at the center of creation. That's what biblical stories tell us. And the very moment in which we are chased out of the Garden of Eden is very emblematic of a rapture. The rapture between our immersive selves in nature, in harmony with the animals around us, as you can see here in this painting by Cranach, and the awareness of our nudity. The expulsion from the Garden of Eden is emblematic of this separation from the natural world, a separation that becomes traumatic, and a separation that we continue throughout the history of what we call civilization. We continue to try and explain, justify, make sense of. And one of the most meaningful moments in the history of the West, in which we try to come to terms with the futility of human life, happens in the Renaissance. You will remember during the 1340s and 50s how the Black Death killed millions of people around the world. And the question nobody could answer was why? Why is God punishing us all, his most beloved creature, killing millions and creating an enormous amount of pain? So from that question that it's impossible to answer, emerged humanism. Humanism, which was the study of us in the context of the arts, literature, history, poetry, mathematics, the empiricism, the notion of measuring and testing nature in order to understand where we stand in the broader context of nature, brought us back to a centrality, to the centrality of representations of God like we see in the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo that we know inscribe a human brain. So you see in this overlay of the human brain and Michelangelo's representation of God, the quintessential manifestation of something extremely important to our centrality, which is reason. Humans reason, animals don't. That's what Aristotle told us. That's what humanism recovers as its quintessential standpoint upon which to build a modern humanity. And again, I'm really simplifying this journey through how we became the center of the world. But of course, many of you have heard about René Descartes. He was the most important mind of the Enlightenment when it came to setting the foundations of our relationship with nature. To Descartes, animals were machines. They were not sentient and they had no feelings, which of course led to series of actions and philosophical maneuvers that subjugated the natural world even more. There is something interesting too, as I'll say later on, about Descartes' assurance that because he reasons and because he's capable of very careful reasoning, he's also not mad. We're going to talk about the connection between nature and madness before we land into Ligabue's work. And so you'll understand how this all fits together. So while today we talk about ecology, human being come more readily from egology, the notion of us being the center of it all. You can see here this diagram explaining quite clearly how an ecological system can be seen as a pyramid in which plants and simpler organisms occupy the lower layers, and at the very top, of course, we have a human, while an ecological view of the world knows no hierarchies and capitalizes on equality, diversity, and interconnectedness. So there is this long-standing disease in our thinking that I have called anthropocentric miseducation that carries with it hierarchies. Hierarchies are always dangerous. We carry with us in society, and they don't really help us. We carry them with us in thinking about art. We carry them with us in thinking about human life, the value of human life. When it comes to art specifically, there's this key moment in the history of the West that changed everything. This is Philibien, André Philibien, who was a historian that theorized the hierarchy of genres in Western art. He said, "He who produces perfect landscapes is above another who only produces fruit, flowers, or seashells. He who paints living animals is more estimable than those who only represent dead things without movement. And since man is the most perfect work of God on the earth," right, that story again, "it is also certain that he who becomes an imitator of God in representing human figures is much more excellent than all the others." So these ideas had actually circulated in Italy already before he theorized them. And they circulated in the academies. The hierarchy of genres meant a lot to art. It meant that artists who wanted to become famous would focus on history, mythology, and religious paintings. These were the big canvases with lots of important human figures and naked people. And moving below, you would find portraits, landscape, and then still life, animals, shells, all the genres that Philibien has listed. This hierarchy was no coincidence. It was the artistic interpretation of the Aristotelian hierarchy that had already resurfaced during the humanist revolution of the Renaissance. And you can see this connection here that's really interesting between, of course, plants. They're the low, the bottom, because they are perceived as passive. Well, we know that they're incredible creatures in their own right. And as you move your way up, and it's no coincidence we're going up, you're moving up towards God, right? So this tells us already something very important about associations that we deem implicit between the lowliest that lives close to the ground and the sky, the heavens in which God resides. Now, madness and animality, as I mentioned earlier, are intimately connected in the history of what we call civilization. Now, this is where things are going to become more complicated. So bear with me, don't lose me. There's going to be some philosophy coming your way. It's good exercise for the mind, so I say. What is the connection between madness and animality? Like I said earlier, Aristotle argued that the human is the rational animal, and rationality is what separates us from humans. I'm sure that, from animals. I'm sure that many of you can at a glance probably come to terms with the idea that we are not very rational most of the time. So there's another question about what is rationality, right? What do we deem rational when it comes to human behavior? And using the mad as animals builds an interesting bridge in which animality becomes the truth of madness itself. So throughout the history of the modern world, starting from the 1500s, 1600s, we witness a process through which madness threatens the modern man, the man of humanism, the centrality, that centrality that is so important to the man of humanism is threatened by animality because it represents the possibility for a return to something darker, something less human. So madness can be understood in different ways. We know that the conception of madness has changed throughout history. We know that who was mad at a certain point, who was considered mad at a certain point in history, then is not considered mad afterwards. Thinking, for instance, about homosexuality during the last century. So madness is not a fixed category, but it's a fluid conception that it's imposed on others, upon a group that considers themselves sane. And that's where the paradox begins. There's something particularly fascinating about this notion of the fear of living, of being too close to animals and being associated too closely with animals. And we can see that from the movement from being closer to the ground with our posture and how we stretch towards the sky. There is a symbolism that's embedded in this notion of leaving the animal behind. But years and years have gone by and no book retains that incisiveness that Foucault's Madness and Civilization does when it comes to theorizing how madness was essential to define normality. Now, the book has been criticized by many, left, right, and center, of course. It's a very complex book. It was Michel Foucault PhD thesis as it goes, but still it contains many notions, many ideas that are important. And one of them, of course, is the idea of normality and marginalization. The idea that who is normal needs a non-normal one to identify and segregate in order to retain that normality. So this flip side, the other side of the coin, is essential. So broadly speaking, Foucault's argument is that the humanist rise towards the Enlightenment, which is the apogee of the centrality of the human and the rational human, of course, that is, required madness to become tangible, and it required madness to become something we could subjugate and something we could separate in a way that would enable supervision, observation, but also exercising, also mastering, to the point that we felt in control of those who did not comply with the behavior that was expected by society, and at the same time could metaphorically feel in charge of our human, of our animal selves that we still know exist within us. So it's in part a practicality and in part a metaphorical need to move away from the animal. The Ship of Fools, which is discussed by Foucault in his book, is perhaps a metaphor too. It never truly existed. A ship sailing with those afflicted by mental illnesses. But it helps him to articulate this need to separate madness from reason, a separation that becomes reality with the opening of the great hospital in Paris. And there is something interesting about the General Hospital in Paris and how it becomes an institution in which poverty can be exercised as well. The hospital wasn't necessarily a hospital in the sense of today. And what I will do now is draw a connection between a few important factors that we need to acknowledge before we move to Ligabue. So the General Hospital was a place in which the poor were admitted, as well as those afflicted by mental illness, in order to be removed from society and in order to be extrapolated from this idea that normality is connected to wealth and is connected to a functional society. So poverty was perceived at the time as a punishment associated with the devil. So we're thinking about the 17th century. The poor threatened society. They threatened the order of society itself. They were deemed lazy and deceitful. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Idle thumbs, of course. And the idea of the poor and the notion that the poor doesn't work links to the idea that work nobilitates. So in a functional society, the poor is closer to the animal. And in the General Hospital in Paris, it is conflated with madness. And according to Aristotle, as we said, madness is what characterizes the animal, not the human. So you see this animalization of the poor happening. But once the poor, which has been animalized, is placed in the General Hospital, it can be domesticated. And this is where things become more complicated, because the domestication is a process through which we have tamed the wild of the animal, the irrational part. We have gained control over animals in order not just to benefit from their work, their meat, and their derivatives, but to metaphorically exercise the animal within us. And domestication, in a sense, is a way to make something fit the societal restriction, the societal codes. So a process of domestication might redeem those afflicted by mental illness, might redeem the poor in the context of animality, which must be identified, confined, and repressed. Again, in a sense, domesticated, so that the modern man can emerge as rational and superior. And in truth, we can argue that we're all mad, right? Think beyond the institution. Think about what's going on in the world generally and find what we could describe as sanity, or sanity that lasts for longer than 30 seconds, right? So I want you to contemplate this idea, because I think it's important to consider the notion that the madness that was attached to Ligabue is not necessarily madness as in a dysfunctionality. So this is from Foucault's passage. Madness borrowed its face from the mask of the beast. Those chained to the cell cell walls were no longer men whose minds had wandered, but beasts preyed upon by a natural frenzy, as if madness, as its extreme point, freed from that moral unreason in which its most attenuated forms are enclosed, managed to rejoin by a paroxysm of strength the immediate violence of animality. This model of animality prevailed in the asylum and gave them their cage-like aspect, their look of the menagerie. So you see this connection between animality and madness being present. And of course, we find it in representation, in the arts, where the association with that which is evil, with that which represents madness, takes on the form of an animal. So what does this anthropocentric miseducation that connects animality, madness, the poor, and domestication do to our conception of artists that fit in one way or another into this category? And one thing we haven't said yet is that Ligabue was an outsider artist. So some people call outsider artists naive artists. These are just like different iterations of a similar concept. But of course, a very important self-taught artist that shares something with Ligabue is Van Gogh. In fact, many times Ligabue is referred to as the Italian Van Gogh. And history of art is in a way mythologized, right? The artist afflicted by mental illness. And if we'd like to say that, if we acknowledge that Van Gogh was also afflicted by mental illness and we look at his paintings, we see something interesting. We see an ability to represent nature in a way that strikes us as different from those that have preceded it. And there is something to be said about madness in this context. And there is something to be said about what we are special, what's special about us. If there's one thing, I guess, that we consider ourselves special in terms of being human, that is really this sense of alienation from the natural world that we have conquered over millennia of becoming human. As a result, we have become obsessed with ourselves. That's the anthropocentric miseducation. And there's a self-referentialism that pervades every autobiographical approach to artists, especially outsider artists. Outsider artists are very much targeted by this approach in which nature is represented. So if the outsider artist represents nature, the approach of the art historian has always been that of saying, well, they are representing their animal selves. The animal selves that we have repressed is now coming out through the expression of their art. And that approach is extremely limited because it oversimplifies the complexity of these artists. Another artist who we don't know suffered from mental illness in a clinical sense, but was an influential outsider artist in France in the 19th century is Henri Rousseau, who also shares a lot of similarities with Ligabue. The similarities are, again, related to this desire of representing nature in ways that nature has not been represented before. So outsider artists do have this propensity to consider nature as the main theme of their work, and they end up representing it like nobody else has done before, not necessarily because there is an animal within them that is coming out, and therefore they feel a sense of affinity with animals, that it's a reflection of who they are. But there's a much more complex range of reasons for why this might be that I want to explore through the work of Ligabue. So as we saw, Ligabue was born in 1899, and originally he was born in Zurich, from an Italian mother. The father identity remained unknown, and the very early years of Ligabue are complex. They're problematized by behavioral issues that eventually led him to be expelled, hospitalized, and then expelled from Switzerland at the beginning of the last century, around 1916, 1917. The arrival of Ligabue in Italy is problematic because he finds himself wandering around the Po Valley, and he finds himself wandering around as a homeless in a scenario in which he looks different because his striking looks are distinctive and make him stand out substantially from others, from the other locals. And at the same time, he is unable to communicate with the locals because he only speaks German. And as such, he becomes a target very, very quickly. We know that at the beginning of his life in Italy, Ligabue finds himself the target of people who find him different, who cannot accept him, and people who ridicule him for being different. And that's what I'd like us to consider for a short while. If we try to forget for a second what the label madness entails, and we really think about the notion of diversity and how madness could be part of a spectrum of diversity, then what we see in his paintings can take on a different meaning. A lot of what we see far too often dictated by this label that it's applied on his behavior instantly, far too quickly. And we have to think about Italy at the time in the 1920s and the town of Gualtieri in Emilia Romagna, where he settled because his stepfather was from Gualtieri, and the mentality of a village, mostly of peasants, who is not culturally prepared to engage with somebody who comes from elsewhere, from somebody who is different. And of course, we have, a number of people who lived close to Ligabue would tell you that Ligabue was particularly sensitive, that it was very kind, a positive presence in the community. And yet, a lot of his behavior didn't fit with the expectation of people. So he was marginalized, he was ostracized. And one of the interesting aspects of his being different, his being one of a kind, had to do with this enormous amount of empathy for animals. An empathy that was actually seen as madness. So we forget sometimes how we've moved away from certain aspects of our relationship with nature, from considering certain aspects wrong, and we accept them today, but that's not always been the case. Those of you who have been interested in nature from an early age know that, or probably encountered moments in which you have been ridiculed, you have been sidelined, you have been called a strange. Being too close to nature after a certain age scares people. It brings back that fear that the animal within us might come out again. At some point, it's part of the anthropocentric miseducation journey to leave the animal behind. How can we be empathic towards the natural world and care about it if our desire is constantly that of leaving nature behind because we've grown into modern man who are afraid of the irrationality that the natural world represents. And what we see in Ligabue's approach to painting is much more than a process of identification. We know that Ligabue was vegetarian, for instance, which when you think about it in the 1920s and 30s was groundbreaking. He was seen chasing away animals if he knew hunters were around to prevent them from being killed. Does it sound like madness to you? Or does it sound like a person that it's extremely empathic? And because it's so empathic, this person is struggling to fit with the alienation that instead characterizes everyone else around him. And you add that experience to the previous experience. One of the things I haven't told you is that Ligabue was traumatized as well by the loss of his mother and brothers and sisters who apparently were killed, so he claimed all along, by his stepfather, who served them rancid meat to eat. So when you start adding a number of traumas, loneliness, the loneliness that it's caused by the feedback loop of the labeling of madness on those who are afflicted by mental illness, then you can start seeing why at some point Ligabue's life becomes a journey of no return. It becomes a journey of a self-fulfilling prophecy where his behavior will always be strange, but will always be strange in part because it's not madness, it's ahead of its time. Being vegetarian at that time was really groundbreaking, and being vegetarian because of empathy for animals was groundbreaking. And another aspect that is unclear about Ligabue that points towards a very contemporary, a very ahead of its time personality is his desire to wear female clothes. He had a very difficult relationship with women, as we know, and it remains unclear if he ever had sexual interaction with men or women, but there's this documentary that was filmed in 1962 from which I have extracted a couple of stills, and this is part of the very little footage about Ligabue that's a documentation beyond the paintings that we have or a few still photographs in which Ligabue sits on the bed, he puts on these female clothes, and he just says, you know, he was very hermetic when it came to using words. And he explains to the director that he feels good in them. There's something about the clothes that make him feel right. And that's what he does. And I think, again, when you think about the level of education of somebody like Ligabue, who had only finished the second or third elementary class, and the society he lived in, I find this power that he has to follow his convictions or drives or ideas, regardless of what people think, really contemporary. I don't see the madness. If anything, I see the madness in those who lived around him and whose mission was always to repress him. So there is an interesting question here as well about freedom that we're going to explore through his work. But of course, as it often happens with outsider artists need to be discovered, right? There have been instances of doctors working in hospitals when he was hospitalized, noticing his artistic inclination. But we also know that when he started to wander along the River Po in northern Italy, he would make sculptures of animals using clay that he would just lift from the banks of the river. And it wasn't long before somebody will become a very important friend of Ligabue noticed his talent. And this was Renato Marino Mazzacurati, was an artist that allowed Ligabue to express himself through paint and sculpture in ways that remained original to what the artist wanted to paint. Again, we have very little knowledge of the sources and reference points that Ligabue accesses at this time during the 30s, the 40s, when he really begins to paint more steadily and make sculptures. But you can imagine that having been in close contact with Mazzacurati, he probably accessed a number of important references of the time in terms of art. However, there were a few instances in which he says, I have never seen the work of Matisse up until like the 1960s. So it's really hard to tell. And there's also a question about the way in which he used to relate to his art. You can see him here, what seems like pulling a face to a sculpture he made. And what he's actually doing is sort of negotiating the relationship of creation with this animal entity that he's casting. So he would actually scream at the paintings and scream at the sculptures and replicate animal sounds. And that, of course, gives art historians the license to argue something very easy and reductive, that he perceived himself to be closer to animals, and that therefore he identified with them. And I think, again, that is a very simplistic reading of what he was doing. And it's a very simplistic reading that is very anthropocentric. It's this notion of, I am an artist, my art is all about me, and if I paint an animal, it's me as an animal, right? That really takes away something else that we know Ligabue knew very well. We're going to explore through his paintings. So early paintings by Ligabue tend to look like this. There's, I'm sure you can appreciate as well, the similarity between not perhaps so much Van Gogh at this point, you will see that later on in some of his works, but with Rousseau, there's a strong similarities related to the exotic animals that Ligabue paints, as well as the circumstances in which he paints them. And you can see that very often Ligabue paints animals confronting each other or hunting scenes in which animals are hunting. It's not a surprise to find a skeleton. This has also been interpreted in different ways. It's clearly a human skeleton. And it might be a reminder of our inadequacy with the natural world, our inability to be in the natural world, a natural world that will kill us if we return to it. There is something interesting about the early paintings because they seem more narrative driven, more dramatic, more, in a sense, driven by a sense of history and place. As you can see here, Traversata della Siberia, which means transversing Siberia, is something he could have not experienced firsthand himself. So we know that Ligabue sourced images from books, history of art books, and other media, like sometimes films that he saw. But that also changed. This ability to look around himself and to represent what's immediately outside the door then begins to populate his work during the 40s. And I'm sure you can see here a kind of like breeze of Van Gogh blowing through the work of Ligabue. We can see how talented he is, of course. We can see how able he is to represent reality in a way that makes sense in terms of its coherence. We can see a certain approach that suggests a closeness to these animals. During the 40s especially, there's a very important shift in which his paintings become a lot more detailed, as you can see here, and the brushwork is more intense. It suggests texture. There's a different attention to the fur of the animals. Look at this fox and all the brushwork that went into creating the effect, as well as the plumage of this cockerel, the details that go into the cracking of the soil, as well as other creatures he positions strategically for you to discover bit by bit. We see beetles on the left-hand side. We see some butterflies fluttering on the right. And we also see a snake hiding here in the grasses. We see dragonflies hovering. There's a whole microworld that, in a sense, reminds me of Baroque painting that populates Ligabue's work at a time in which Baroque painting was a far memory. And here's where we encounter another issue with the interpretation of Ligabue's work, which is this idea of the survival of the fittest. So art historians have always rushed at reading the work of Ligabue because Ligabue presents us with scenes in which an animal subjugates another or kills another animal, with this reading that ultimately is representing this notion of the survival of the fittest. But I think there is a lot more here. And if you reject or press pause on the idea that he identifies with the animals he represents, which, as I mentioned, oversimplifies what's going on, you can see Ligabue here basically painting the essence, the real existentialist essence of our planet, which is not a pretty one. The essence is not the survival of the fittest, it's not this kind of evolutional idea, but it's the idea that in order to stay alive, we have to kill something else. And that is a condemnation of life, the condition of life itself on this planet. The idea that if you're an animal especially, and of course some plants, and you can also extend to some viruses, bacteria, your survival depends on the killing of something else. Where does that leave us in ethical terms, in terms of negotiating this possibility or impossibility of being ethically clean or clear from the stopping of something else or someone else's life? Even when we kill a plant, if we feed on plants, we're still, the role on this planet is that you must terminate or curtail or impact somebody else's life in order to retain your own. Now, to me, that is a much more important realization that Ligabue expresses through his works than a representation of the survival of the fittest, which is always seen in the context of a struggle that it's very human and that it's very much based around our society. If we buy into that reading, then we're taking away Ligabue's paintings of nature from Ligabue. If we give in into this anthropocentric temptation to read the paintings as the metaphorical representation, an allegory of human struggle, then we are missing the point, I would say the beautiful point, of a man who was not accepted by his contemporaries for being utterly different, and who was able to see nature in a way that his contemporaries were not. Some art historians have claimed that his references came from Liebig collector's cards. Now, those of you who are joining in from Italy will remember Liebig as a stock cubes brand, and these cards, these collector's cards, circulated easily. It was one of the manifestations. They started to be produced at the end of the 19th century, and they were readily available by the 20s, the 30s. It was one of the image revolutions of the 19th century, in which the reproduction of images was so much more affordable, and these figurines began to be collected in working class households. There's something interesting about this mediation. what is Ligabue's relationship with nature then becomes mediated with culture, and it's then returned again to an idea of nature. We see some of the animals he paints that he would have never seen around him. I'm going to show you a few leopards that he painted repeatedly. Certainly were not around in his local area in Emilia Romagna, but they become an obsession for him. So again, I also would like to resist a simple classification of Ligabue as an artist who always paints animals with an agenda of proximity, an agenda of wanting to be close. He also saw animals like others around him would see them as orientalist icons. You know, Orientalism was one of the most persistent waves that in the West idolized felines, giraffes, the megafauna of Africa, India, and South America as a distant dream. So again, Ligabue's approach to painting animals is not easy to categorize. And I think it's an invitation, this difficulty, to give up the temptation to stereotype a man that lived according to no stereotype. There is a violence that we can perpetrate as art historians when we talk about paintings in a certain way. And there's a violence that we can perpetrate as viewers when we consistently and persistently continue to look at paintings in a certain way, despite the fact that some paintings are pointing into different directions. This is one of the funniest ones again, the Black Widow. You can see a Black Widow that becomes an enormous spider in the mind of Ligabue, because I think what Ligabue was also able to do is to devise his own mythology. This is another thing that anthropocentric miseducation has invited us to forget about our relationship with nature, which is that it's within our reach to invent mythologies of the natural world that make us engage, that make us love nature. Unfortunately, since the Enlightenment, science has produced an enormous amount of knowledge that it's invaluable. And at the same time, it has stripped nature of its magic. And there is something there, it's a complex double-edged sword where we have gained a lot, but we've also given something up. We've also left something behind. And sometimes it takes somebody who's an outsider, it takes somebody who's not accepted by others and experience solitude to recuperate that magic for us and to make us participating into that magic. And I see a lot of that in the paintings of Ligabue as well. The way in which he devised certain scenes and the ways in which sometimes, like in this case, he creates very hermetic scenes of domestic intimacy, painting a spider web. You know, the idea that Ligabue wasn't trained traditionally, the idea that Ligabue wasn't concerned necessarily with pleasing others is complex in his career, because despite the fact that he was poor, that he depended for a long time on the charity and kindness of others, he also had a clear idea in mind of what it meant to be an artist. Sometimes in an arrogant way. He knew one thing. He knew that artists matter in society. He knew that he was nobody in society, but he also knew that his art could elevate him and that his art could make him somebody. And I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the career of Ligabue is that that moment happens. It's in 1961 when an exhibition of a solo exhibition is organized at the Barcaccia Gallery in Rome. And to Ligabue, who had previously only tried to sell his paintings on the piazza of Gualtieri and was laughed at by his community, this was an incredible moment. He had become an artist in the professional sense, and he doesn't like it because for Ligabue, it was impossible to insert himself in that social circle in Rome who was appreciating his art. Collectors began to buy his art a few years prior. Money started coming in, and yet he still couldn't find his place in that world in which he did not belong. It was very traumatic for him, and unfortunately, there's only another major retrospective of Ligabue's work in 1963 at Guastalla, and then Ligabue dies in 1965 after he has an accident, a motorbike accident, and seemingly recovers, and then unfortunately his condition deteriorates, leading to a partial paralysis of his body, which prevents him from painting, and will pass away in 1965, leaving behind roughly 870 paintings, which is a pretty substantial number of works. There's a number of sculptures as well, as you have seen, that were left behind, many more than the ones I showed you tonight. And unfortunately, also, Ligabue had the tendency to destroy a lot of his work. It would destroy a lot of his work when people laughed at it. It was his reaction and his way of communicating a kind of anger towards this difficulty in communicating what he felt and how he felt being alive, how being alive felt to him, and the negotiation, the struggle of negotiating the acceptance of others and the desire to be part of a community. I guess that one of the other interesting things is how he becomes religious at the very end of his life and wants to take the communion before he dies, because he feels like a sense of perhaps being lost once is in a hospital bed for too long and is away from nature. All that he loved so much is no longer there to allow him to carry on. There's something fascinating. I don't want to leave you with the death and the darkness, but there's something really fascinating about bunnies. He loved bunnies. And again, when we think about madness, I just can't help but smile at the idea of a man who loved to keep bunnies as pets at a time in which keeping bunnies as pets was absolutely not an Italian idea. Like in certain areas in Italy, dogs and cats would be where the line is drawn. So there's something very fascinating again about how he doesn't fit the box. And to him, bunnies were a memory from his upbringing in Switzerland. And he would often surround himself with bunnies that he then gave to peasants to care for, because he'd have too many, bunnies multiply. And then he'd get very upset when they kill the bunnies to eat them, because to him, they were just companions. And again, it would be ridiculed for being so attached to animals. It would be ridiculed for caring about their lives. And the question still stands: who was the mad one in the time in which Ligabue and the place in which Ligabue lived? And of course, today he is a very well-respected artist. I also care to say that with the money he made towards the end of his life, he managed to buy 11 motorbikes. He loved motorbikes very much, so not little. And he had a private car with a driver as well. So there was certainly a moment in which he accomplished the elusive dream of becoming a successful artist in his own life. But today he is considered one of the most important artists in the history of modern Italian art. And there are many exhibitions that have taken place just over the past few years as well, continuously reinforcing his mythology, but I also feel most often reassessing simplistic views on what this man really represented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giovanni. I would say we have time for maybe a couple of questions. I see one in the chat, so I'll start with that one. And I think indirectly you answered the question, but I think it's interesting to reiterate that too. And the question asks if Ligabue was institutionalized as an artist.
Yes, he was, well, institutionalized, I think, as in terms of mental illness. Yes, he was. He was in hospitals and psychiatric asylums more than once throughout his life, at least 3 times. And he was, his behavior, again, in those institutions was problematic and often led to a lot more stress and a lot more suffering than he had already incurred.
And so I guess I'll ask the other meaning that I read into institutionalized, like for him being an outsider artist, at what point he became institutionalized in the art sense, so like in arts institutions. And you said he was having like a hard time having, you know, relations in the art world. So what did it mean to him? And like, was him, you know, was he living through that, or was he really institutionalized just after his death?
Well, like fame happened late in his career. So the 1960s, the 5 years from like 1961 with the first exhibition to 1965 when he dies are important. But there was also a key moment in the myth, you know. I think maybe one day we can give a talk about the myth of the artist. I'm writing a book about it, so maybe that's when it'll happen, next year. But the artists we remember are never just remembered because their paintings or works of art are beautiful or more beautiful than others. There's a process of canonization that takes place in a number of ways. And sometimes it can be a theft, like in the case of Mona Lisa. You know, Mona Lisa became quintessential artwork when it was stolen in 1911 and recovered in 1913. It was reproduced around the world and it became famous. And in the history of Ligabue, there was a process of pontification that took place in the late 70s when Rai did a 3 episodes mini-series on Ligabue. And it captivated the Italian audiences like nothing else. The mini-series is available on YouTube without subtitles, if I remember correctly, but if you speak Italian or you want to practice your Italian, it's great to watch. And there isn't much dialogue for most of the first part, as you can imagine, as Ligabue wanders around the countryside in northern Italy. But yeah, that mini-series really captured the imagination of the Italian public. And from then on, exhibition after exhibition, he was canonized as a relevant artist in the history of Italian art, and perhaps one of the most original artists in the history of Italian
art. So I see that there are some questions coming in, and so the second one that came in is this one, and it says, if you could imagine what kind of nuance does spirituality, not religious spirituality though, would bring into Ligabue artistic reflection at the intersection of nature and humanity?
That is a really interesting question. And again, there are different avenues in which we could think about this. I don't think it would be wrong to contextualize his work as a spiritual quest. If we think of a spiritual quest as a matter of finding one's own position in the world, I think that's why I reject the simplistic notion that Ligabue is painting animals to represent his madness, because the animal is associated traditionally with madness, and therefore by painting it, he's expressing something that he cannot quite articulate in words. I think the sooner we leave behind that cliche, the better. And I know my art historian colleagues are not giving that up anytime soon, because it will entail acknowledging that this man was in love with nature in a way that people found ridiculous, or that people found futile or laughable. But I think there is something that we could call spiritual if we think about it that way. You know, if we think about this question about who am I in the context of creation, and how can I negotiate my position in a way that it's personal, in a way that it's not institutional, in a way that it's mine, right? In that sense, this can become a slippery slope, because it also leads us towards the romanticization of nature that we saw during the 19th century. But I think there is something more here because of the intention of the artist. You know, the intention of the artist comes and goes in art historical interpretations, as in we take it into account, and then we also craft a space in which we can see more than what the artist has said into the paintings, which is where paintings remain alive for posterity, where people can see more in them. But at the same time, I think just in this case, relying on what, on the sources that have been passed on to us from people who have lived with him, people who have helped him, who recount stories about his love for animals and his love for nature. There is enough to suspect that a spiritual dimension is plausible, whatever that meant to him. You know, I don't want to kind of like impose anything more.
So I wanted to go back for a second to this idea that you brought up about, you know, the ethical relationship with nature, right? Mm-hmm. So I was interested in this idea that, you know, nature calls to survival in a way that means that we prey always on other beings. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when we think about climate change today and ecology today, there is, you know, the sense that in order to survive as part of nature, as part of this ecology, we need to preserve more so than, you know, preying on other beings, right? And so do you see this as sort of an ethical paradox? And do you think Ligabue and somehow perceived that and like expressed it in his heart?
It's hard to tell exactly what he perceived and expressed deliberately beyond what has been passed down to us. But certainly, I think as a starting point, a person who deliberately chases away birds and animals so that they don't get killed by hunters, or that releases fish that's being caught by others in order to set it free again, is aware of what you've just explained, you know, this preservation and this idea that animal life is worth something, that it's not just worthless. And even his affection for the bunnies, I think, as a pet, which breaks the rules. I mean, even when I grew up in Italy, you'd be frowned upon if you kept unusual pets. And we're talking about the early 1980s. You know, it was only, I think, during the 90s that keeping a pet snake or a pet tarantula in Italy became a little bit more common, but it was coming from the United States, you know. So I think, in a sense, this notion of preserving and this notion of empathy with him is not quite ecological in the sense of environmental. It's probably there, but in the sense of individual to individual. So he is able to recognize an individual essence in the animals that tells him that the life of the animal is worth as much as any other being around him. And you can argue that that's already an ecological thinking in a sense, but I don't think that he's concerned with environmental realities, as in preserving the environment, simply because those notions were not developed enough in Italy anyway at that moment in time. You know, when we think about the first ecological concerns emerging in art especially, or in people who were concerned with art during the 1960s, 1968, Arte Povera, channeling the ideas of the reckless urbanization. His work doesn't strike me as concerned with that specific aspect, but it certainly expresses more than once an appreciation for natural beauty itself and the beauty of the landscape and the serenity or the wholesomeness that the landscape can induce in an individual.
Great. Well, thank you, Giovanni. I think we ran over our time, unfortunately, so I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions. But Giovanni will be with us again on March 31st for the second lecture, which will be on Luigi Ghirri and his representation of botanical representation through photography. I also just wanted to remind everyone that starting tomorrow at 1 p.m. Chicago time, you'll have free access to the online streaming of the movie Hidden Away, directed by Giorgio Diritti. The movie explores the tormented life of Ligabue before his talent as painter was publicly recognized. So pretty much a movie that, you know, tells, again, in the cinematic way, the stories that we talked about today. The movie is part of an ongoing series called The Cinematografo, which includes five movies, featuring Italian actor Elio Germano. And we have 3 more weeks of movies programmed. You can find all the information to access the streaming on our website. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Thank you, Giovanni, and we'll see you soon next time. Thank you.